Our passions are clearly expressed through our priorities. If a person's life can be likened to a train on a track, then his priorities can be likened to the rails on which the train runs. Because our priorities eventually become the direction for our journey through life. In Exodus chapter 3 verses 1 to 4, we learn a lesson in priorities from the life of Moses. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Moses was looking after the flock of his father-in-law for many years very successfully, when one day he has an encounter with God on Mount Horeb. But the point of my message is this, that Moses could have missed this encounter with God if his priorities were out of place. This passage shows us that living with right priorities is what took him into the fullness of this experience. Here are two factors that could have caused Moses to miss his visitation. Firstly, his frame of mind. He was shepherding a flock of sheep, which was a big task. His mind was on his responsibility. He led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, so we clearly see that he was seeking better pasture land or grazing ground for his sheep. His thinking faculty was fully engaged in looking after the sheep. He would have been thinking thoughts like, where can I find a better pasture? Which direction should I go? Is there a stream close by? How long will it take me to get there? Will I be able to get back to camp in time? Is that area safe for the sheep? His mind was fully occupied with work when God met him, and that says a lot about his consistency. Moses was a reliable and dependable person who knew how to take on responsibility. That tells us that when we are looking after our responsibility quietly and consistently, we are in a good place to experience God, because God honors responsible people. It might seem like an unlikely time, but that was God's time for Moses. Secondly, an unlikely place. He was not in a spiritual environment like a church, a synagogue, or a prayer meeting. He was in the wilderness. There is nothing religious about the wilderness. If Moses was seeking to encounter God, that's the last place he would have gone to. And that tells us that any environment is a potential place for God to work in our lives. The Bible shows us that Moses encountered God in an unlikely place at an unlikely time because he lived with right priorities. A person with right priorities will do well in every situation because in his circumstances, he will look for opportunities to fulfill his priorities. Why? Because priorities are the expression of our passions. So whatever we are passionate about on the inside will translate into priorities on the outside. So even though this happened in an unlikely place, at an unlikely time, Moses did not miss the opportunity to encounter God. Take a look at the experience of Moses at the burning bush. At first observation, all he saw was a bush fire. There's nothing unusual about a bush fire in the wilderness. But what was so unusual about this one? The supernatural presence of God was hidden in a natural circumstance. It seems that God often does that. Very often his supernatural presence is hidden in the natural things of our daily circumstances. Whether or not we discover his presence in our daily living is largely dependent upon our priorities. When we seek first his kingdom, we are living by priorities that are designed to bring us into the presence and purpose of God. Then Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Here's where the kingdom priorities show clearly in Moses' life. When he saw the bush burning but not getting consumed, he realized that God was trying to say something to him. That tells us, firstly, that he had a passion for spiritual things. He was willing to step out of his routine and check out the fire. He was willing to take the time to go and look closely at what was happening. When he sensed the supernatural presence of God near him, that became to him the most important thing. At that point, he was willing to turn aside from other things. Let me put a question before you. Are you willing to sometimes step out of your daily routine in order to follow God? please note that God drew him out of his routine, and God will sometimes draw us out of our routine. Secondly, God was able to draw his attention in a quiet, subtle way. Just a quiet bushfire was enough to get the message across to Moses. God did not need to send a blazing forest fire. In Jonah's case, God sent a storm to get his attention. Here's another question. What does God have to do to us in order to get our attention? Does he have to send a thunderstorm or a blazing forest fire? Or can he reach us with his still small voice? Please note that God was watching Moses' response to the burning bush. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." God was watching to see what Moses would do. When God saw that he turned aside to see, God called him by name. And so revelation came with right response, and right response came with right priorities. For many years, Moses was a man of hidden priorities. For 40 years, he was a prince in Pharaoh's palace. He lived in a high secular position, but a low kingdom priority, because he had to be friends with the very people he was supposed to fight. Therefore, it is not surprising that in the first 40 years, there is no record of any significant experience with God. Why? His priorities were hidden, therefore the presence of God stayed hidden. That tells us something. If we don't live with God's kingdom priorities, we will have a difficult time experiencing God's presence in our daily living. At the burning bush, when Moses turned aside to see, he made his priorities known. He was saying, "I must see this because this seems like God is trying to say something to me. My life is about divine purpose. This is my priority, to seek and to serve my God." When the Lord saw him reveal his hidden priority, God revealed himself by calling out his name. So this passage brings out a very important key on how to consistently experience God. We can know God's presence in every situation and circumstance when we live with God's kingdom priorities.